Thank you, Bernard, for your introduction, and thank you to the Serpentine Galleries, and of course to Hans Ulrich Obrist and all the staff. In 1989, Félix Guattari gave a clear insight to what we now call the Anthropocene. What we find in the three ecologies is indeed a deep diagnosis of the three sides of what one can define a general political ecology: psychic, social, and environmental. And such a diagnosis seems absolutely actual. Take a look, for instance, at this quote. Conversely, the three ecologies attempt to draw the ground lines of what we might define, in the wave of Simondon and Stiegler, a collective ecological individuation, in which, as Guattari argued, individuals must become both more united and increasingly different. It should be a collective individuation produced in order to ward off the entropic rise of a dominant subjectivity, as Guattari argued. That is the anthropos of the Anthropocene. In the same way, the ecological dimension of this new individuation would consist, and I quote, in the articulation of a nascent subjectivity, a constantly mutating socius, and environment in the process of being reinvented, with the aim of a renewal of humanity's confidence in itself. This could be conceived as a first attempt to indicate the path for a neganthropology in the terms of Stiegler. Insofar, neganthropology has to be conceived as a radical bifurcation from the entropic path of humanity, an entropic path driven by a capitalism that is literally destroying knowledge, conceptual and critical knowledge, know-how, and know-how to live. If this process is called proletarianization by Stiegler, neganthropology should consist in a deproletarianization. And about subjectivity, we are confronted to the atrocious effect of what Antoinette Rouvois and Thomas Burns called algorithmic governmentality, in which individuals are reduced to a set of calculable data in order to be anticipated in their behaviors. Within a similar perspective, but with more emphasis on labor and value exploitation, Tiziana Terranova describes what she calls the neo-monadic architecture of subjectivity through the image of the individual and its digital device with its screen. According to Terranova, such a new monad, far from being isolated, is rather inserted in the simultaneous and social process of constitution of a multitude of digital traces, the set of agencies at the technological level, but also the international division of labor. Nevertheless, it seems worth to speak about the monad insofar as such devices are constructed for individual use. Digital devices pose being alone as a precondition for being together. According to Terranova, faced to this situation, we need a new concept of monadology able to describe contemporary social memory and literally reverse the individual closeness into collective openness. In order to do this, she brings from sociologist Gabriel Tard an interesting new monadological perspective. In liberal theories of social production, technologies such as digital objects are nothing but tools which individuals use to cooperate, while agency is allocated exclusively to the human individuals. Such a perspective is rightly defined by Terranova as more reactionary than Leibniz's very concept of monad. To the extent that, while for Leibniz, the individual was not a monad, but an aggregate of monads, theorists of social production maintain his notion of individuals as closed unities harmoniously cooperating with other closed monads. What is actually Leibnizian is the idea of pre-established harmony that in the neoliberal cosmology is guaranteed by the invisible end of the social, which supplements the invisible end of the market. According to Tard, who criticized Leibniz's pre-established harmony, cooperation between monads is not based on a peaceful exchange, but on a symmetrical relationship of capture, which presupposes a Nietzschean struggle of forces, that is to say, a social and psychic economy of power, where the will to power that drives every monad could determine two possible tendencies, towards avidity and hostility, and so to expand itself, conquering the whole world, or towards sympathy, tending to form bonds and develop sociability. Now, what I attempt to suggest is that a cross between Stiegler's pharmacology and Viveiros de Castro's cosmological perspectivism could offer a contribution to a new concept of monadology, even beyond Tarde's neo-monadology. Indeed, at least two things remained unaccomplished within Tarde's perspective. First, the technological condition with its pharmacological dimension that contributes to the two tendencies, hostile and sympathetic, the two tendencies of the monad. And second, the general ecological outcome, that's to say, the two phases of the Anthropocene according to Stiegler's perspective. The colonizing role of Western reason and the evolution of capitalism driven by science, epistemology, and technology finally led to the contemporary stage of computational capitalism, parallel to the last ecological stage of what Jason Moore called Capitalocene. And following Moore, we can say that the greatest transformation of this process of planning by Western operational rationality occurred when the opportunities for accumulation by space were attenuated, and capitalism passed instead, I quote, to the colonization of time, precisely the great force of neoliberal financialization, end quote. This is what is at stake with algorithmic governmentality, to the extent that it preoccupies the future of the individual insofar as they are driven by drives, preference, or attitudes tailored from their profiles. According to Stiegler, the calculation, anticipation, and computation of the self destroy what Nietzsche called the exception, and finally, devalue difference as such. This is the other phase of the Anthropocene, that is a phenomenon consisting in the entropic destruction of diversities and is therefore inextricably entangled with digital capitalism and with the political cultural problems to which algorithms have given rise. In this vein, just as neoliberal globalization is destroying biodiversity with the pollution and devastation of habitats, the technologies of cognitive capitalism are accelerating proletarianization and cultural homogenization. This is what Stiegler thinks in terms of disruption, of which ultra-right-wing politicians such as Marine Le Pen, Donald Trump, or Matteo Salvini would be symptoms. This techno-nihilistic and techno-fascist, in the sense of Norbert Wiener, phase of the Anthropocene, is the result of nothing less than a sort of epistemicide by Western reason that, after destroying other forms of knowledge all around the world, that is to say, after destroying the other, turns again itself, a kind of epistemicide suicide caused by the colonization of the time of consciousness. Thus, perhaps, a counter-affectation of the Anthropocene should let emerge new complicities to be developed from out of this epistemicide, and perhaps a global decolonial becoming to be generated, a composition of heterogeneous knowledge whose survival seems more and more like a first-order political question. In this sense, I would like to indicate one of such complicities. The colonization of time and anticipation of desires and the erasure of differences and diversities caused by the Anthropocene appear as our own way to be captured by a stranger perspective, as like as it occurs in what Viveiros de Castro called Amerindian perspectivism, a theory that postulates the positionality of the subject and an original state of differentiation between humans and animals. This means that, on the one hand, the position of the subject is variable and can be occupied by humans, animals, plants, the earth, and so forth. On the other hand, and consequently, that the common original condition of humans and animals is not animality or nature, as in Western thought, but humanity itself, or culture. That's to say, the fact of occupying a point of view, a perspective. Instead of multiculturalism, Amerindian cosmology proposes multinaturalism. There are many natures or worlds as much as points of view. Perhaps we are in presence of an ancestral neo-monadology. In such a cosmological perspective on perspectivism, one could see a radical concept of monad, accomplishing Deleuze's suggestion expressed in the fall. A point of view, according to Deleuze, it is not exactly a point, but a place, a position, a site. That means a locality. And the subject will be what comes to the point of view. It's not what generates the point of view. But, as Viveros de Castro said, a monad or a point of view determine in multinaturalism something that we can say like this. It's not about a plurality of views of a single world, but a single view of different worlds. So, coupling the Deleuzian definition of point of view with its Amazonian correlative, one could argue that more than a fixed subject or an isolated substance, a monad is to be conceived, first of all, as a locality, a point of view that gives place, as Stiegler defined dans la disruption. Amerindian point of view is a monad, a locality that gives place to a world. What Amerindian perspectivism calls humanity is thus access to locality, that is to say, what could be expressed by any entity to the extent that any entity gives place to a world. Now, although this is always possible, it is always a struggle. And the struggle for locality has to be conceived as a struggle for individuation, which can in turn be thought in terms of Nietzsche's concept of interpretation, that is, as will to power. Through such a translation, it now becomes possible to attempt a diagnosis of algorithmic governmentality as a kind of viewpoint with respect to the world. Whereas Amerindians have jaguars, we have, for instance, apps or a social network. And whereas they have the Amazon, we have Amazon.com. To be captured by algorithm is to be captured by another kind of individuation, one that is not ours, but rather technical individuation. And it is to lose one's own individuation. This means, in turn, that once our perspective, that is, our psychic and collective individuation, is captured, we no longer interpret the world in an active way. We no longer have access to a locality. And we instead find ourselves interpreted by another perspective through the data we secrete onto the internet. In this sense, Amerindian perspectivism could also be helpful for a critique not only of Western reason, but of digital neoliberalism. Viveros de Castro affirms that a point of view is pure difference, and it is just such a difference that we are losing when we allow our own point of view to be captured by algorithms and to become our digital profile. This perhaps could be a topic to be inserted within a U-Quiz Cosmotechnics, but also a way to raise the question of Marcel Mauss' internation. Thank you very much.